Greetings. I wanted to give you a brief introduction to the material in Chapter 6 of the textbook. It's a bit different than what you've read about so far because it delves into research methodology and discusses the techniques that claims makers use to assess the impacts of their messages on the public at large. It's actually an important point to pay attention to because claims makers are obviously interested in determining the effectiveness of their efforts to influence public opinion. As we've learned, activist groups have a variety of different strategies and techniques that they can employ to bring about concern for their cause. They can offer different kinds of typifying examples. They can use particular statistics, or, as some of you learned, not use statistics at all. They can enlist celebrities, they can present different kinds of warrants, etc. It may seem crass to say this, but it can be useful to think of claims makers as issue entrepreneurs trying to sell a message. In this respect, they have the same interest in measuring the results of their activities as a company selling soft drinks or toothpaste or soap. Evaluating the effects of different messages with different audiences that are sent through different channels helps claims makers target resources in ways that will maximize their effectiveness. If you're running an organization, for example, that was dedicated to reducing homelessness, wouldn't you want to know if people were more moved by a photograph of a newly housed family or one that showed images of a tent city? So Best talks about several ways of that activists use to assess the effectiveness of their claims. He talks about sample surveys and focus groups, and he says a little bit about analyzing social media. Okay, well, if you go on in sociology, you'll most likely be taking a research methods course. And in the course like that, you'll spend a good deal of time on each of these different methodologies. Here, we just have time to touch on two of them briefly. A sample survey is just what it says. It's a survey of individuals who have been selected at random from some population of interest. A local claims-making group, say, that was opposed to granting permits for hydraulic fracking, would survey residents who lived near the site of the fracking, whereas a group concerned with drunk driving might issue a survey of residents throughout a state that was thinking about where there was some legislative interest in raising the drinking age. The point here is that it's too costly to survey everyone who might have been exposed to a claims-making message, so instead a random sample is selected, and if done correctly, that random sample will be representative of the population at large from which it was drawn. And then it will enable activists to gauge the effectiveness of their messages. There are a variety of different survey strategies that are available to claims makers. Sometimes a survey is sent out in the mail, and respondents are people who respond to a survey. Respondents will complete the questionnaire and send it back to the group that is administering the survey. Such groups have address files from which they will randomly select names and addresses. Other times, however, surveys are conducted online. An online survey, of course, requires a list of email addresses, which is more or less impossible to obtain since email addresses are not publicly available. It's still possible to survey claims-making groups' members, but then, of course, we're no longer talking about public attitudes towards a particular claim or message. Most often, public opinion surveys are conducted by telephone. Telephone surveys are relatively inexpensive, at least compared to mail surveys, and they're a bit easier to field. But there are challenges, but they bring with them unique challenges of their own. With the advent of voicemail and caller ID and other kinds of call screening technologies, an increasing number of people are choosing not to answer calls from pollsters. The problem here is that those who agree to speak to a pollster, to a survey interviewer, I should say, may hold opinions that are different than those who are not willing to speak to that pollster. A key element of any random sample is that every member of the population has to have an equal chance of being included in the sample. People who refuse to participate, of course, do not have such a chance, and the results of this survey may be biased. We've seen this recently in the polls conducted just prior to the 2016 presidential election. Voters favoring Trump were less likely to respond to pollsters, which made it appear that Clinton would win the election. And we all know how that turned out. Another problem with any type of survey is the effect of question wording on the answers respondents give. For example, consider these two questions. Do you believe that convicted felons should be considered for parole once they reach the age of 55? Compare that to this example. Should people serving long prison sentences for crimes committed in their youth be eligible for parole once they've reached age 55? Which one of these do you think is more likely to bring forth a positive response? Okay, so there's an art to survey question design, and there are rules for writing survey questions that researchers have to employ to minimize the biases that can creep into survey questions. But questions nonetheless are never entirely bias-free, and responses always have to be interpreted with that in mind. Another problem with a survey is that they typically mostly employ fixed choice answers. And this leads to another problem for researchers. Such questions are often unable to pick up nuances in respondents' views about an issue. As Best points out, for example, many discussions about abortion imply that people can be easily classified as either pro-life or pro-choice. In truth, most Americans have attitudes that fall somewhere between these two extremes. People may favor abortion for what they deem to be good reasons, but oppose abortions for reasons that they characterize as frivolous. So a simple question about whether a respondent favors or opposes abortion can't accurately reflect these kinds of complex attitudes. And of course, this also assumes that respondents actually have an attitude or have an opinion about the issue that they're being asked about. Often they don't, but not wanting to appear uninformed, they provide answers to pollsters' questions. This can leave the impression that they are more concerned about an issue, though in actuality, they spend very little time worrying about that issue. Despite these limitations, there's no doubt that public opinion surveys play an important role in learning about the effectiveness of claims-maker and media messages about social problems. Researchers supplement their use, however, with a variety of other techniques that are designed to address the limitations inherent in the use of surveys. One such technique that Best talks about is the focus group. A focus group is a small group conversation with members of the public which is designed to gauge their views about a particular social issue. In a focus group, a moderator poses a set of questions to a group of individuals and encourages those individuals to discuss the questions in much the same way that you would talk about a topic around the dinner table. Focus groups usually consist of 8 to 10 individuals and last about 2 hours. In a focus group, participants have more freedom to express themselves, to qualify their remarks, and to explain their beliefs in more detail than is possible in any kind of a survey. Since each group, however, requires a moderator and a space in which to hold the group, and considerably more effort in analyzing the discussion, focus groups are much more costly and don't have anywhere near the reach that a sample survey would have. But they can offer insights that surveys are incapable of capturing. Be sure you pay attention to what Best says about the role of focus groups in changing the kinds of messages created by pro-choice activists in the 1980s. I think you'll find it quite interesting, particularly because it relates to what we learned in Chapter 3 about warrants. Okay, I'm not going to say much about how researchers analyze traditional and social media for clues about public attitudes towards social problems claims, because I know that these lecturettes can sometimes go on and be too long. There is, however, a long history of research, on traditional media, and more recently, researchers have started to examine things like Twitter feeds, Facebook posts, and even search histories to learn about the kinds of issues that concern the public and how they make sense of those concerns. I'm also not going to talk much about folklore or urban legends or jokes as indicators of the public's interest in social problem concerns. I think that you'll find what Best has to say about these subjects interesting, but I'm going to leave it to him to explain why they're worth studying. I do want to circle back, though, to what Best says about the media's role in claims making. As he points out, that role is primarily one of agenda setting. Agenda setting is the process through which attention is directed towards an issue. So rather than influencing how people think about an issue, the position they take, their attitude towards some condition, the media plays a role in determining what people think about. So let's take climate change. It provides an excellent example. Prior to the 1990s, few people had an attitude or an opinion about climate change simply because they didn't recognize it as a condition. Until the media started covering the issue, in other words, until it was placed on the public agenda, it was non-controversial simply because it didn't exist in people's minds. At least initially, the media didn't play much of a role in influencing public opinion about whether measures needed to take place to address climate change. Many media outlets, in fact, took a neutral stance and had a willingness to hear from both environmentalists and folks who denied that climate change was a serious problem. This belief in the importance of issue neutrality is rapidly being abandoned as our politics have become more divisive. Though still, for many less politically charged issues, the media's role continues to revolve around agenda setting, putting things in front of the public rather than advocacy. Okay, so in closing, I just want to mention that I think you'll find what Best has to say in his end of chapter case study very interesting. These case studies really bring the chapters to life for me, and I hope that they'll do the same for you. Okay.